Let's get close, but not so close. Quarantine. You can share from a distance. Quarantine.
It's good.
You know we want to see each other. You'll have to stay in your quarantine space while we talk.
Welcome to this 12th edition of Quarantime. Hi, I'm Peter Hirschberg, and we have been at this for about 4 weeks now. We started the show as this COVID crisis started because we were realizing that while the press was really covering all of the immediate urgent issues, just under the surface was an amazing amount of innovation and single-minded purposefulness. And in a way, what we've been doing here has begun to be almost a weekly chronicling of a TikTok of what people cared about. Early on, what's the cause of this? How are people organizing for reaction? More recently, we had shows that were thinking through, how do you bring back the nonprofit center? What happens next with cities? This week, as the whole world starts to look at, or certainly the United States starts to look at what comes next, how do we bring back our economies? How do we get out from social distancing? The other thing we're realizing is the new normal isn't normal. And I think as I look at Facebook feeds and I talk to people, the mental mishigas of this, or the fact that we kind of realize that that this loneliness, the sense of isolation, the dealing with the shock is kind of coming to a fore. We realize that this crisis, so maybe 3 million Americans have COVID-19, but probably 300 million of us are feeling the effects mentally. So this week, we wanted to focus on some of the mechanisms that can focus on mindfulness and transformation and mental health. And in particular, because many of us are in kind of the technology and innovation community, technologies that are being used for that. Technologies that can improve our mental health, that can kind of get us calmer, that can accomplish the kind of things that ancient wisdom practices have done. And we have an amazing group today. We have Nicole Bradford, who leads Trance Tech, which has been a nonprofit and a conference that focuses in this arena, but she put together an international group of speakers yesterday with an audience of about 1,200 in a virtual conference where both the latest developments were discussed and also how is this community dealing with a crisis in real time as innovation sped up. We'll hear from Nicole. One of the companies that launched yesterday was Robin Arnott's company, which has a product called SoundSelf, which is a virtual reality product with an interaction between your voice and created visualizations that pull you into an altered state. And that's just one of many products that are coming. And then to help contextualize how all of our senses are changing, we'll be talking to Crum, who's the chief scientist at Dolby Labs and is a Stanford researcher. And boy, there's a lot there. So that's what we're going to contextualize today. And, by way of background, throughout the 20th century, we've realized that as we have been becoming denser, introducing more and more media, people have always felt a little bit knocked off their equilibrium. And this far predated the internet. Here's Professor Henry Jenkins at USC, who was talking about how in the early 20th century, as we got into skyscrapers and cities and denseness, people felt they were going crazy.
Do you struggle with the issue of distraction personally?
And I don't know anyone on the planet who doesn't struggle with the issue of distraction personally. You get pulled in every direction today. But this is not a new issue. Go back and read descriptions of the progressive era walking down the streets in New York and the sense of your eyes being pulled in every direction by the hubbub of the crowd. People described it as being like electrocuted, bolts of energy shooting through you from every direction. People as early as the 1960s were telling us we're moving to a reality of information overload. So the point is, this is a problem that we as human beings have coped with throughout most of the 20th century into the 21st century. And the good news is we survived it. As a culture, we learned how to adapt to it. So what we are seeing is a period of evolution. And at the end of the day, we're better off as a society if we go at this with a sense of open-mindedness and exploration.
Now, what's happened in the last few weeks is this has been sped up. The amount of new types of media and the ways in which the balance between our senses is being affected, being on Zoom calls, losing the personal connection and getting all that information that comes in from when you watch how your colleagues work, even to the point of the smells that we have because we're probably eating takeout food or the same stuff all over the time. This has changed. And the person who put media in the greatest context, I think, in the 20th century was Marshall McLuhan, who wrote Understanding Media. And his whole point was when we change the balance between media, which we've been doing when we've been all at home looking at screens, we change who we are as people.
All media are extensions of some human faculty, mental or physical. The wheel is an extension of the foot. The book is an extension of the eye. Clothing is an extension of the skin. Electric circuitry is an extension of the central nervous system. The extension of any one sense displaces the other senses and alters the way we think, the way we see the world and ourselves. When these changes are made, men change.
That clip was from 1964. We know that because it was black and white and because the only people who changed were men. That brings us up to the present day. And here, my co-host, Mickey McManus, for today's exploration. Hi, Mick.
Hey, Peter. Yeah, no, I think it's kind of fascinating. I know you love to dig into the past, and the Marshall McLuhan is a quite good one. And this notion that like the wheel is an extension of the foot, or the clothing is an extension of the skin, it's sort of a second skin, is really powerful. I think not only are we having Zoom overload, but we're getting kind of sensory deprivation as well, right? You look out in the streets and there's nobody there. You go walking around and it seems like a wasteland and empty. And you don't get just the wonderful sense of touch or feeling or anything when you shake somebody's hands, give them a hug, or any of those kinds of things. So it's kind of the two extremes. A number of people are having challenges on both sides. I think we all are kind of facing this global kind of attack on our senses and also depletion of our senses. So that's why it really felt important today to have this crew of people on. It just seems like they're doing some wonderful and weird and amazing stuff. As always, we're using a live, infinite, asynchronous and synchronous whiteboard. So Omid, I don't know if you can pull that in, but today we've got Nicole and Robin and Poppy. But the whiteboard itself, you can kind of pan out and actually get a sense of every episode that we've had, and we can go back in time. And over time, our hope is to kind of start drawing connections. By the way, if you go to our site, you can click on the Miro link. We're not really associated with Miro in any way, but we're playing with this technology. And anybody is a public commenter today. So if you wanted to pull out a Post-it note while I'm drawing and do something, I would just ask that you be nice. But it's one of those things where we're just experimenting with what happens if more people want to draw together. In the physical world, drawing is used all the time to kind of help collapse disciplines and become the lingua franca. You jump up and you draw at a whiteboard together and draw blobs for nouns and arrows for verbs. We're being limited that there are no good capacities for that today. So let's keep moving on with the show. Peter, how would you like to set up what I think Nicole's going to come first?
Watch this. Let's just bring Nicole in.
Yeah.
Hi there, Nicole.
Hi.
Excellent. So Nicole, well, we've known each other for years, but we've been collaborating. Actually, the three of us have all been collaborating over the last year. Why don't you set up Trance Tech? Because you were kind of early on identifying that this was kind of a new branch of where technology and mental health and kind of wisdom practices met. So set up, what is this field? And then talk to us a little bit about this extraordinary convening yesterday and what we learned.
Yeah, I mean, ultimately, what transformative technology is about leveraging technology for the inner landscape. And that inner landscape is where we really do our growth and development. And that is a big part of transformation. And so we're interested in transformative tools, not just for, the same endpoints that people get to with meditation, but also for the entire landscape of mind. So that's mental and emotional well-being, and then social and emotional flourishing. It's really like, how our inner landscape affects how we interact with other people. And then the last part being human potential and performance. And for us, the it's a continuum. So on one hand, you have supporting people mentally and emotionally. And so, we look at tools for stress, anxiety, depression, happiness, sleep, like all of those things that are the building blocks of well-being. And then the center part is social and emotional flourishing. And so that's self-awareness, emotional self-regulation, and then all of the skilling that comes into place to teach me how to be really good at interacting with you. So it's a very human to human point. And then the third part on human potential and performance, of which Robin's product is a really great example, is expanding and enhancing consciousness and cognition and emotion, and then also, really pushing on the boundaries of the human experience. And so for us, we see it as all the same thing. And for me, the big part of it is that today, access to those things, and it's interesting to see the referral to the past, because in the past these things were also very inconsistently available to people. And there's a big part of me that's very democratic in that, and maybe it's being a from where I grew up and where I came from, but I really want things to be I want foundational tools to be equally available for people. And the crux of it is the tech's on exponential curves, the crisis are on exponential curves, but human growth and development, how we learn to be, feel, and become is very linear. And so transformative technology is really about applying the leverage of technology to make the growth and development and our ability, our foundations, also exponential. So, not a requirement for people, but it certainly should be a foundation for people, because even today, the ability to go to a monastery and study is actually quite an elite experience. Yeah. And I want it to be widely available.
This is a very big point, right? Because the maker movement was about democratization, mobile technology was. I want to remind people, you're watching Quarantime. We are at quarantime.today if you want to see all of the past shows. And if you're putting comments in on Facebook or YouTube, they'll stream in and we can ask them here today. Nicole, let me ask you this. Leaps forward in consumer technology are generally based on, or consumer products are based on technology changes. For example, our whole mobile web world and mobile device world really happened because we had a huge increase in processing power in tiny, small devices. We had the cloud and telecommunications, right? And then we had sensing technology that led to where we are. What's happened in the technology world in either neuroscience or sensing that has allowed this mindfulness tech to burst forward?
Yeah. Well, so a couple of things. I'll tell you what's allowed it to really burst forward, and then I'll tell you what we really need. And I see that my friend Alex Lloyd is watching, so yay. And so, really what it's been is, there has been the underlying research, which I'm sure Poppy will talk about how the brain works, how the body works. A lot of the tools that we use in developing, or the things that get tracked in developing these types of products, are medical signals that have been understood for quite some time, but were confined to labs and hospitals. So like heart rate variability, galvanic skin response, EEG, like these types of things that were, medically understood, but captured in labs and medical institutions. And so there's the foundational piece, which has continued to evolve. And then the second part is the sensor proliferation. So, the first round of products that allowed people to have EEG at home, ECG, medical grade ECG at home, all of these different things that are proxy signals for psychological state. So the second part is sensor proliferation. But then, you could pick up all these signals. Often they were noisy, filled with artifact, the sensors were expensive. So it's that exponential curve hitting on the sensor prices and the size that allowed them to go into different things. And then making sense of that, really, it's been AI. And so, the ability to do, or machine learning at this point, because, so a lot of machine learning. So it's writing alongside AI. What we really, 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 really need, what we have to get, we have to get data sovereignty and privacy, because the insight into the inner landscape is incredibly personal, and getting even more so. And so I think that in order to have people really be able to use this for growth, they have to be able to have privacy with it. And so that is one of the areas that I spend a lot of time thinking about and talking to people about and advocating in our community for.
One of the interesting things about this COVID crisis, I think we said this in our first show, is that this is kind of like being teleported into a science fiction future, right? One where we're all like brains in a jar and we all have to be connected. And it just turns out that that's driven the need for, like all these things we talk about, like privacy, between the contact tracing stuff that we need and the personal information there, and now the personal information from our brains, we went right to the future.
I'm curious on the data sovereignty. I just want to make sure that our viewers kind of know where you're going with this, Nicole. I think, it's one thing when we would enter our credit cards. That was a big deal. I remember in the 90s, like people were like, nobody will ever buy anything online, and nobody will take a credit card. Digital banks are never going to work. The internet is not for commerce, and people would get really upset. But then suddenly, hey, we're okay with it. We're entering our credit cards, but you can insure against the risk of your credit card being exposed. But it's one thing to insure against your risk for that, but when it actually is like people know my mental state, people know if I'm feeling self-doubt, people know if I, all these really deep and rich things, I've lost my sense of hope. Alex Lloyd, who's watching the stream, asked about what hope is. And I think this is a part of that inner landscape, but it's very different when we're talking about theft of my personal state. And people using my personal state to manipulate me. And that's maybe why sovereignty is just sort of having ownership over yourself and being able to allow people to selectively maybe have access to it. We've historically done that with just having a house or a tribe or something. And now it's pretty liquid. So when you're talking about this data sovereignty, like what do you see as good news in that space? Like, are you seeing anything in the transportational tech movement that you get you're heartened by in terms of data sovereignty or ownership of and privacy and things?
Well, a part of it. So we've had we actually dedicate a significant chunk of all of our online education and also our live programs to ethics and ethical frameworks, because I think it's I think that it's really, I think it's difficult to know what the right, it's difficult to know what the right tools are going to be for different types of products, especially in a category where we don't actually even know what's coming. And also people have different levels of comfort with different levels of privacy. And so I think, there's one of my favorite designers is a person named Joe Edelman, who was actually the first person who gave me hope. Because as I started to get into this category, and I've like the ability to see, the ability to start to track cognitive decline based on keyboard usage. So not even what you say, just the tension between one key and the next over time. It's like the things that I saw. I spoke to someone a little while ago who has basically they can see cognitive load through the optical nerve. It's like that is like really invasive, and so we don't even really know what's coming, but different people have different comfort levels with different things. And one of Joe's premises is that do-gooders cannot treat people like Tamagotchis, meaning that we can't decide what's good for people and then, and do that. But I think there's a level of regulation. And I think, people should be able to slide their band as to what they're comfortable with, and what sort of value that they demand for what they're comfortable with. And that's the kind of thing that, standards can be, ethical standards can be about how upfront those are. Like one of the things
Nicole,
that
I have a question, perhaps pulling this all into what went on yesterday. You know, Alex asked this question about what gives us hope, because there's a lot of hopelessness out there. I thought one of the extraordinary things about your conference was you convened yesterday, in the middle of all this, the top experts in the field. So I'd love to hear, what were some of the highlights yesterday? What gave you hope? And how is this whole community adapting to this very real crisis that did not exist a month and a half ago?
Yeah. Well, so a couple of things. One, you said we had 1,200 people. We had 2,200 people over the course of the day, which was amazing. Especially when we decided, I decided with my team, we decided to do this 3 weeks ago. It was like the first week in April. We wanted to basically support people. And so the idea was, okay, let's just go to the companies that have products in market and ask them to provide free trials or discounts for people. And then, and basically like create that and give that gift and put it out in the world. And it started out small, and then it just really took off. We had, I think 140 exhibitor booths where you could go in and you could look at videos and ask the companies questions and get a discount or get whatever their offer was. And then all of those companies had sessions. Many of them did. So we had over 100 sessions.
What's your sense for like the top 3 or 4 new things that got on the table, or that we learned, or that, kind of astounding?
Or things that surprised you a little bit, maybe even, as you started watching and how it was all coming together, what were standouts for you? Because you're obviously more seasoned in this, you've seen this stuff.
Well, one of the things that I was surprised about, that I actually really enjoyed versus physical events, is that the ability for people to actually understand our entire thesis. Because our thesis is it's very unique. We're actually kind of the only ones who've been putting out that thesis of the continuum of human mind and technology to support, and that they're all interrelated. That it is actually all connected. And so for me as a convener, or really it's convening is one part. It's like I have a thesis that I convene to share with other people. And so it was really surprising to me that it was sort of like, I could tell people, and some of the feedback I was getting from people, even people who have come to our live events, that they actually could see the entire thesis at once. And so that was really interesting for me. And I wasn't really expecting, basically deliver a higher level of understanding of the vision that we have. So that was really kind of cool. I intentionally focused. I had lots of sections on social wellness and ways to use technology to connect people. Just because already even before this we had a loneliness issue and a human interconnection issue. And as you guys know from previous shows, I'm really not a nostalgist. Like I actually think that humans were bad at human connection, and that the ability to be in place together actually covered up a whole host of sins of not actually having any skills.
It was almost like they were sloppy or something.
So Nicole, last night as I was writing the intro to this show, I was aware of the fact that my brain was really nuts. I was feeling isolated, disconnected, whatever the symptom of COVID on the mind is. I had that so much so, like I had writer's block. I could not write about mental health technology in a positive way last night because my brain was mush. So one of the questions I have is, speaking of this loneliness, these symptoms we have, what are some of the, maybe some specific things that you saw yesterday that might be products or technologies that literally, now that we're all at home isolated, make a difference? Yeah, so one of the products that I really love is with a company called People Power. And what they do is it's a tool for people to help
their elders stay in their homes longer. And that's a really important thing, because in California, the cost of a nursing home is $13,000 to $15,000 a month, and so it's not something that most families can actually handle. And so as people are aging, like, what do we do? And we have the kind of cities where people don't live with their parents anymore. And one of the things many people might not know is that the bulk of elder care actually falls on women, and it's usually one of the daughters ends up doing it, and that is, it's a really challenging situation for caregivers. It's really hard for caregivers. So caregivers have their own issues, and then also, like, how do you empower a family to take care of an elder so that it doesn't fall completely on a one person? And so they have an entire, like, at-home IoT thing that goes into the walls and stuff like that, so you can tell if someone's fallen. It doesn't require you to have it doesn't require that they have the alert chain that they pull, and with permission of the elder person who wants to stay in their home, it helps the family see what's going on. But the other thing it does is it has an app that allows for task distribution across the family.
Nice.
And it has reminders. So it's like, if the four of us were taking care of someone, it would sort of like automatically make it so that Mickey knows he calls on this day, and Peter calls on that day, and I call on this day. And then I can put in the app, I wasn't, as the female, I probably would end up, having a lot of the care. And I can say, oh, would you go to the grocery store for me? So it takes the burden. It helps spread the burden. So it's just a beautiful,
Nicole, this reminds me too that, I think this is impacting a lot of people. This is this notion of, can we allow our next generation, our last generation, to remain at home independently longer? And I remember doing some studies with IoT in the earlier days, the 2000s, where we would see that there would be a reduction in mortality by somewhere on the order of 50, 60, 70%. If you could just find out somebody fell somewhere in the house, within 4 hours, it would radically change, if the parent or grandparent survived. And and in a sense, the washing machine in the laundry room actually knew she fell. It had a sensor. It just was locked inside the washing machine. Or the refrigerator actually had a sensor to turn the light on. Never told anybody that nobody's ever looked in the refrigerator for the last 15 hours or something. And so really early on, we started to see these signals, but they were very expensive signals, right? And communities wanted to be able to manage it, whether it was a family of caregivers, whether it was the nurse practitioners or others who could really see and understand stuff. And so this is pretty exciting.
Is really going to get into signals that we're aware of, signals that we can sense. Hey, Nicole, why don't you tell us where people can look at the recorded versions of this? And then I want to bring in one of the products that was introduced yesterday.
So one of my other favorite products is my friend Robin, who's coming up next. But we have to post all the videos, but people can go to our website, transformativetech.org. And from there they can, get to videos and other things. But, I would say that the real takeaway is that it is, especially now, a fast moving category. And, right before COVID happened, the trends that I was watching around, that's the lab site. Do it, transformativetech.org, please. Thank you. So right after, even before COVID happened, the trends around need, demand, and means for, this becoming a very dramatically moving category, all of that was already happening. And so when this happened, I did a briefing for the entrepreneurs in our network, and I went back and I looked at every single trend that I had been tracking before and all of the micro trends, and every last one of them only gets amplified by COVID. Every last one of them. And so, one of the things that is also really optimistic is that the last time we had this much pressure on the social fabric, and that was in 2016, when Facebook just sort of melted down our relationships with one another, and families were fighting and screaming with each other about, politics and everything else. That was the time that meditation became the fastest growing wellness activity in the United States. and it still has been. And so, one of the hopes that I have, out of all of this, and it's just because it's like, really, yeah, one of the hopes that I have is that this is 10 to 100 times worse. We haven't even gotten into the economic, the economic repercussions of the tail of this and what that's going to do for jobs and, so many other things. So we haven't even gotten to that. And so this is 10 times worse. And so I'm hoping, that at least one outcome might be that the return to connection, the return to desire for hope and faith, and and thinking about what really, really, really matters. That similarly to when the last time the social fabric got stretched, and meditation became a great outcome.
I think you may be answering
and we'll see
Alex's
this.
question, because what there is to be hopeful about is when we create problems, humans get incredibly creative about what to do about them in ways we hadn't even thought about ahead of time, right? I mean, that's what we're seeing.
Yeah.
I just want to say, go ahead.
Just a general maturation where it's like there's a, sometimes you have to, it's like the first time you have a ton of sugar or the first time you have a ton of tequila, it's like it's really good until it's not. And then there's a moment where you're like, okay, less sugar, less tequila. And so, I think we were in a place where we were moving so fast in the world, and we had really sort of put our social connections to the side, like the deep social connections. And so, my hope is that now, we take the pause for those of us who can, and I'm cognizant that not everyone can.
One thing I learned getting ready for this episode is there is such rich stuff here. We're going to keep bringing this back because there's just so much to mine. You mentioned the fact that meditation was one of the fastest growing categories. And now for meditation like you've never seen it before, let's bring Robert Arnott up. Robin. Hi, Robin.
Hi, good to be here.
I was working so hard to pronounce your last name right. I got your first name wrong. Okay, so we're about to take a look at your new product, SoundSelf, which was inspired by kind of the tension between, I guess, your work in gaming and technology and experiences you had at Burning Man. So why don't you tell us what you've brought together and what you've been working on that literally launched on the gaming platform Steam a week ago?
Yeah, well, I've been working in gaming for about a decade. And I was always really interested about how gaming can shift people's state. Like everybody's either seen or been that person who's glued to a screen. I don't think there's a single creative medium that is as entrancing as video games are. And it was after my first oneness experience or mystical experience or however you want to call it, that I had this insight that same trance creating structure that is a video game. A video game is just a set of rules and you interact with a set of rules. And when you're by interacting with a set of rules, it changes who you are in that moment. Like maybe I'm a king or a conquistador or something like that. You play a role. And I had this insight, which was just that, look, a meditation is a game. When you're meditating, and this was a little bit before, it's really interesting. Nicole points out that when 2016, and there was a crisis of connection, and that's also when we had this boost in meditation. So I started working on this a little bit before then, and I remember it's still feeling taboo to talk about these sort of mystical or spiritual experiences at the time. But I had this insight that just a game could be used to structure a person's attention in the same way that meditation does. But because of the sophistication, the technological sophistication of modern gaming, we could blast someone off and give them a really transformative experience of stillness or of peace. And I think we're just beginning to scratch the surface on what's possible when you treat a video game as a state shifting experience.
Now, operationally, in your game, in its best incarnation, it involves what? An Oculus, so that you're immersed visually. And then I gather it takes sound that you create, stuff that you speak. And then there's this relationship between how you're chanting or creating something and how the game operates. So there's some theory underneath this where you're putting something together that gets us to a transformational state.
Yes, absolutely. So people have been using chanting for thousands of years to induce transformative states of consciousness. There's so many Buddhist practices, for example, or even Gregorian Christian practices that are based around toning. And there's reason for this. I don't totally understand all the reason, but at least part of it has to do with the vagus nerve, which runs from the top of your spine all the way through your gut and so on, and is associated with activating the parasympathetic nervous system and calming you down. So when you slow down your breath and tone, that tells your body that you're safe. You feel that vibration in your body, and it shifts the way you experience reality, right? So you combine that with a video game system that is constantly bringing your attention back to your voice. If you have virtual reality, so for SoundSelf, virtual reality is not required. Like, you can play it and have a wonderful experience on a flat screen. You just really have to turn off the lights, and eliminate distraction. That's why we love virtual reality, because it eliminates distraction for you. And I think that's partly why virtual reality is such a breakthrough for gaming technology, because now we can make game designs that are work on a more nuanced level, because we're not competing with everything else in your sensorium that is asking for your attention. You understand?
Fortunately, you've brought with us today a couple of examples. So first, this is really fun. This is the teaser before the game was out. You teased it with a little nod back towards science fiction. So let's look at your teaser.
Let's make it full screen if you can.
Yeah, let's make it full screen.
In 1990, Terence McKenna said, "I think that the difference between computers and drugs is going to migrate towards the vanishing point."
Please full screen the video, turn up the volume, and be advised of strobing effects.
That the computers of the future will be drugs, and the drugs of the future will be computers. In 2020, virtual reality will be my portal to lucid dream worlds fantastic and bizarre. I will occupy these theaters and play out all parts of myself. And if there's half the things my fantasies and
That's pretty fun, right?
Yeah.
I don't even know what's going on there. I feel like I'm too old for this or something. I'm not sure what's going on. I'm only 107. But Robin, I got to ask you, obviously these are the kinds of things that are very hard. Games are very hard to experience third person, like watching on a different medium. It flattens it down. It's kind of like looking at a newspaper copy of some wonderful podcast. That's not the same as actually hearing the energy in the words. I'm actually curious how people right now could experience this. Maybe if they don't have an Oculus or if they don't have a VR thing, can they get the app on Steam as an audio reality kind of thing?
Yeah, absolutely.
Audio reality?
You don't need virtual reality at all to experience it. Again, if you don't have VR, that's fine. I just recommend turning off the lights, because you're totally right. Like to understand, and people, the way we understand games is based partly on our experience of previous games. SoundSelf's inspiration for its game design feedback loops comes a lot more from ritual, from ceremony, and from meditation techniques. And so it's been an interesting challenge to us to help people understand this experience, because honestly, you can't understand it till you try it.
But you also made this point that it's sort of a feedback loop between what you hear, the chanting is actually a feedback loop from what you hear to what you say to what you hear. Do you have any input mechanisms? I'm just kind of curious, so that, what is the feedback loop? Because often game mechanics involve some feedback loop that is emergent, that kind of comes from the player's actions.
Yeah.
Tell us a little bit about that.
This is entirely your voice. So the way most feedback loops in a game, I want to invite you to think of the input, because this will bring us back to something Nicole was talking about with sensors, biosensors specifically. So if you think about the inputs to, I was about to say most games, but I really think actually all games, I would struggle to find almost any game that that doesn't follow this rule. You control games with keyboards, you control games with joysticks, you control games with your fingers.
Yeah.
And your fingers are an extension of your sense of agency, your sense of identity, which means that the only part that the computer feels of you is your desire to achieve something, your desire to do something. It's not feeling your heart, it's not feeling your breath, which means that there's a limitation to how almost any video game can relate to you. It can really only relate to you by the means it can feel you. And if games are really only feeling your mind, so take a game like StarCraft, for example, or really any game, you're communicating to the video game what you want, and what you want is something that occurs at a certain level of your reality, that's mixed up with your identity and so on. But we're so much more than that. Anybody who's meditated for more than a few hours in their life understands that there's so much more depth and richness to our reality than just what we want and what we think we're trying to achieve. So the first really fundamental shift that SoundSelf makes from most video games is we're not listening to what you want. We're not listening to your fingers. We're listening to your voice, which tells us something much more intimate about you. It tells us about your stress level. The rhythm of your voice and your breath tells us about a more soft reality of where you are. And the result of this, because we're not engaging your mind, we're actually overwhelming your mind with audiovisual stimulation, and then engaging your body and the body is where your emotions are stored. The body is where your history, your memory is stored. And so by doing this, we've unlocked for some people some tremendously emotional experiences. Actually, I would love to read. We got this person on Steam. I won't read it, but somebody on Steam. Steam's the mainstream gaming platform, and it's been super experimental to put this, what's actually a transformative meditation experience on this gaming platform for gamers to see what they think of it. It's not what they're expecting. And we saw this one gamer in our Steam community say, I think I'm doing something wrong. I keep smiling and laughing, and I don't know why. And I cried a little bit at the end of the experience. I think I'm doing something wrong. It's like, no, you're
beautiful.
you're accessing something really deep inside of you, and it's pre-verbal.
Yeah.
And it's able to do that because we're not listening to this. We're not listening to what you're typing or what you're moving with your thumbs, what you're thinking about. We're listening to your body, and we're responding to your body.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I'll bring it back to.
I was just going to say, there's a very interesting joke about getting like gamers out of their head, because nobody's more in their head than a gamer that all day long is literally them in a controller. So I could imagine, it's one thing to pull this on someone who's been deep into mindfulness, but it's a hell of a joke to pull on a gamer. There's just a lot of dynamic range there.
Oh yeah, we've been seeing
it's probably beautiful
responses.
Though. Yeah.
No, I'm saying it's in a wonderful way, but yeah.
Yeah. No, and I think it's really interesting. I just recently visited Swissnex, which is the consulate here in San Francisco that brings in sort of Swiss researchers and technologists. And there was some fascinating things going on with body-computer interfaces, not brain-computer interfaces, because the body is cognition, and I think that's one of the things, and we're probably going to learn a little bit more about this from Poppy, who's our next guest. But there's this notion that, there's that classic experiment where they put a plastic arm on one side and then they stroke your real arm with a feather. And then over time they come in with a hammer and they try to whack your plastic arm, and you like freak out because your body has already started acclimating to that thing. And they've now started doing it with VR, where you can, if you're scared of heights, you can kind of pull your body out of yourself and be like 2 feet in front of you. And then they take a real stick with a feather on it and they pat your real back while they pat the avatar's back. And within a few minutes, you actually start believing that's you. And you can walk you out onto the edge of a cliff. And every once in a while, they saw people that had fear of heights would sort of push a button and pull the body back in to feel the sense of craziness over the cliff, and then push it back out again. So it gave them psychological safety. And it was all around body computer interfaces, because so much, even you take action when you take a breath in. And they were able to demonstrate very powerfully that most actions in your life happen when you take a breath in. So there's actually this weird connection there.
We're about to bring in one of the world's experts on this, who teaches at Stanford and spends her life thinking about sound. But to key that up, I want to just show one more clip, because the world of science fiction has been really interested in this whole notion of, what if computers become drugs and drugs become computers? how far do we push this and what does that mean ethically? Here's a recent clip from Westworld that we thought of when we looked at your product yesterday.
Episode 305, it's an idea that Jonah had been kicking around for the longest time. He wanted to play with genre, and we had a way into it with the limbic system.
Cognition, metacognition, human emotion. We already manipulate them with different classes of drugs that push one chemical up, push it down. We think about psychopharmacology now. The limbic implant is our all-purpose idea for how you eliminate an entire branch of medicine and replace it digitally. You take a piece of digital medicine that essentially, it's a license, it's not even a chemical. What made sense to us about that was that it would be prescribable, it would be a physical thing.
Brilliant Aaron Paul, really having fun with the experimental style on a gonzo road trip through hell while spinning out on drugs.
The craziest drug trip of your life, from horror to suspense to action to romance. That was a lot of fun to shoot. The whole episode was just so insane.
Hey, Robin, would you say that your soundscape is an experiment in sort of bringing psychedelics to you via software? Or, in other words, do you believe that this is, because a little of this sounded like it was informed by your experience, at festivals and things, and sometimes I guess people lick frogs or eat mushrooms or something. Tell me a little bit about that part before we bring in Poppy, our next guest, because I think that she's going to round a lot of this out in terms of the senses and neuroscience.
Awesome. Yeah, psychedelics have been a pretty serious influence for me, and we've been hearing people compare SoundSelf to psychedelic experiences for years and years and years. And we just recently did a pilot study to just look at people's brains while they're on SoundSelf and compare that to people's brains on psilocybin, and we found some remarkable and surprising similarities. So specifically a decrease in activity in the parts of the brain associated with the default mode network, and an increase in gamma across the brain. So that's absolutely the intention of this is look, you can use systems design to induce a trance state, and an intelligently designed trance state, just like a meditation, can shift your psychological state. So you don't need to depend for people who do use chemistry, chemicals like LSD or psilocybin or whatever to do this. We know that you don't need those tools. You can also use practice tools like meditation. And we're just beginning to scratch the surface now on how we can use experiential tools like virtual reality and like gaming. But I think we're just at the beginning of this. I think we're going to see, especially as we bring in more biosensors, we're going to see it.
And I think we want to be really careful about, we know so little about the brain in some ways, and yet, this is almost becoming the golden era of neuroscience and cognitive psychology. These cognitive psychologists kind of come from the top down to try to understand mental models and things like that. Neuroscientists come often, or sometimes, I feel very naive about this, so Poppy will hopefully correct me, from the bottom up and look at neurons and how these actions work and things. And people like Adam Gazzaley are actually in FDA clinical trials with a game that's a drug to actually help with ADHD, prescribable by a healthcare system, and others who are kind of pushing the limits of this on neuroscience. But we have to also be aware of, we sometimes see illusions. We're very easily fooled by randomness or black swans, and science. The first thing we have to do as scientists is doubt ourselves. And think about all those things. So we also need to kind of explore that humbleness when it comes to science, and yet it feels like there might be something here, and that's kind of intriguing. And how do we play into that?
That we're watching Quarantime at Quarantime.today, and we have been talking about her for the entire show. Now let's bring Poppy Crum in. Poppy, who is the chief scientist over at Dolby and also teaches at Stanford. And look, when we were talking yesterday, you pointed out that starting a couple of years ago, students got really interested in mindfulness, and you've got a class that's working on these similar kind of closed loop systems. And one of the reasons we kind of wanted to wait till towards the end was so you could help contextualize what we're seeing and where it fits in this evolving world of research.
Yeah, no, this has been a great conversation, and Nicole's one of my favorite people, so it's wonderful to join all of you. Robin, I wasn't planning to talk about my class so much, but it is on right now, and we're doing everything we can remotely. And my class's focus is so relevant to what you're talking about. So, number one, two things, Nikki, you just said, sometimes we see illusions. Well, I think we always see illusions. It's not sometimes. They're the opportunities we get to think about with regard to, technology, and they're the insights we have to when our brain is, sort of optimizing us in different places. We're always in ambiguity, but it's also a big part of recognizing that we each have, my common thread in my life is, every arm of, we each have very unique experiences of the exact same physical information, and they're not right or wrong. They're our experiences, and it is up to technology and the way we interact to optimize that. The transformations that have been happening in the last 5 years that are allowing us to think much more richly, and to Nicole's and goals in a more democratized way is really quite. It's transformative, but it's really relevant. So my class at Stanford is it's a video game development class that I created about now going on about 9 years ago, and every year is a little bit different because it's always driven by where the student's mindset is. But it's neuroplasticity in video gaming. And I like to call it a little bit of my own a breakfast club, where I've had. I always have computer science graduate students from Stanford, as well as I'll have musicians. I'll have individuals who I've had my best VR coder to date is now a Dallas Cowboy. So, remember that. And, but you get elite athletes. I've had the NCAA, tennis champion. I've had really well-known musicians that are, also Stanford students. And, everybody comes together with a different mindset for how they think about gaming, and professional gamers, obviously, how they think about the role of gaming. But the way we approach it is, look, games are so powerful because they are these, immersive, engaging environments, but they're also representative of broader technology that we engage in on a daily basis. So, my overarching theme is that people think from a neuroplasticity perspective about design in what they're building. And it doesn't have to be a game; it can be any technology. That we start there before we design it, and then we design with intent. But from the game perspective, it's we start from because I have really amazing coders. I also have people that have never coded, because my goal is to take everybody on that journey. And so we start with building out old Atari games, and staples. But one of their second week project, they've already built a neural interface into Breakout, and they've designed the whole thing. But they have to control it either neurally, or they have to control it with some other sensor. And slowly you see, the questions are always, try to stay away from what a typical controller would be, because that's constraining how you're thinking about the body, which ultimately is constraining how you're thinking about how you want to engage a neural circuit or what it is you want to be training. And so, all of, each lab that they're, building towards, which is fine, at the end, a final project that's sort of in their passion zone, is really trying to get them to think more about what I like to, I use a term. It's called, I call it embodied user experience, which is, how do we leverage all of these reactive closed loop experiences to drive the engagement, drive the personalization of our game. But also we want to then have the interactions the user's having with that environment be as natural as possible for what you're trying to train, and what you're trying, the space you're trying to put them in, because ultimately that game is going to change who they are. You can play 40 hours of Call of Duty, and we know you see the world differently. You have heightened visual sensitivities. We know that if I play 40 hours of Call of Duty, my probabilistic inference is faster. It's integrating information in a different way. These are really amazing human skills that have that translate to so many things in our lives. And it's really powerful when we can harness that in a really thoughtful design perspective.
So Poppy, when we started this conversation with Nicole and with Robin, we went from kind of the gaming that you've described, Call of Duty, and then we went wider, and then we added into it human sound as the input mechanism to then embody us. Mm-hmm. You've been doing a bunch of research on all the kinds of things that we can sense, and a lot of your work is around the ear, because actually from the ear you can sense temperature, you can sense wellness, you can sense state.
Well, actually, Poppy, tell us about this. What the heck? What is the air doing, and why do you know so much about it? Like a little bit of your background, but also what you're discovering and what you're working on with Dolby, who does amazing signal processing and other kinds of things.
Absolutely. And I don't think of myself as just the sound person. I'm a human senses is really, and how our brain integrates them, because, really that's the dynamic interplay that's always happening, is between what we see, I'm a multi-sensory object that your brain's having to decide what to do with that when I'm talking to you. And the thing that, so I'm a neurophysiologist by training, but also experimental psychologist and violinist and way back there. But the things that I think are really exciting right now that we're doing, and others, and Nicole has touched on some of them, are, it's the transformation that's happening that allows this new way of thinking about enabling personalization, reactive, optimized technologies, things that are in tune with my internal state and my intent. And, Nicole touched on these. The drivers of those have become the ubiquity of sensors in our environments, and the proliferation of them, but also the reduction in cost. And then pairing that with machine learning, where you can have, I'm going to I'll talk about the ear in a moment, but thinking about just the eye, because that's going to be really prevalent very soon. My pupil may dilate for, 3 different reasons. It might dilate because of lighting changes. I think we're all familiar with that. But it will also dilate if I'm engaged in something, and it will also dilate if my brain's having to work harder, cognitive effort. So I've got 3 different signatures that are both, that could be, one signature that could be representing 3 different internal states or external state in one case, and that's an ambiguous signature, right? That doesn't help me any. But what's pairing that suddenly with a really cheap sensor like a microphone and some machine learning, and suddenly I know what's going on with that individual. I've taken that ambiguity away, and a sensor that's detecting lighting. The amalgamation of those sensors at low cost becomes hugely powerful to helping understand the internal state. So you've got where 15 years ago it was about $25,000 in a lab to track my pupil, to do pupillometry and track my, signatures of my autonomic nervous system representing my internal state. And now every pair of smart glasses in the next 5 years will absolutely have that information. It becomes a really rich platform for internal experience, internal engagement, internal stress. It becomes, even a predictor of dementia. Once you pair, longitudinal data about someone's, speech, their cognitive effort in responding to certain questions, you've got a pair of glasses that are early, detecting early Alzheimer's cues. And, so you start looking at the way these consumer sensors can become part of my platform to track my own wellness, as well as where it engages with me. And for me, the most important part, both with the eye and the ear, which I'll talk about, is we're in an unprecedented time of these devices that are always on us, providing a longitudinal data set that suddenly enables me to have personalized medicine in a very, in a way that was never possible. And also insights that are, really can never be found from, a one-shot visit to a doctor or something. It's understanding the differences in us and optimizing to us in those ways. So the ear, my sort of things I like to describe it as is it's kind of like well, this is true. The ear is fundamentally the best, it's the fastest and most reactive place to both read and write your brain. You have, and the reason is not just the signatures that we can pick up inside your ear canal, in your concha, just outside your, just right in here, there's basically a cacophony of biological signals that are, of course, that you can pick up right in there. And it's the power of this signature is that it's, also a very strong point to stimulate your nervous system, and that especially your vagal nerve. So I'll talk about that in a moment. You've got just in the ear with different sensors, we can pick up heart rate, we can pick up your blood oxygen level, we can pick up EEG, and then we can do transformations on that signature that let us understand stress, let us understand where your attention might be directed, whether you're attending to something behind you, even though your eyes might be directed in front of you. We can understand, we can pick up what's called the electrooculagram, the signature that's the electrical signature that's created when your pupil moves back and forth. So you can actually know where someone's eye is directed just by reading that signature in their ear. You can pick up signatures of stress, cognitive load, galvanic skin response that Nicole mentioned earlier, which is usually just a small change in skin conductance. You might know it as a lie detector test to a lot of individuals, but picking up those types of signatures are anticipation. So that's that early signature of where some sort of modulatory signal could easily be introduced to help someone be better optimized in a stressful environment.
Hey, Poppy, I've got a question in this, and I love that. I'm trying to keep up with you, and it's very hard, but I love it. Because this notion of the unprecedented longitudinal just means like we can actually track it over a long period of time, and we can actually start to see, wow, attention's going up, cognitive load's going up, something's going down. That's kind of around the internal state. But
yes.
You also mentioned something about the intent. Sort of our goals, and games are kind of interesting because games are desirable difficulty, right? They're not supposed to be like if a usability designer designed Legend of Zelda, there'd be a big red button that said Save Princess. It would be the most boring game ever, but it's about, I've got a goal and I actually go through struggles, difficulties, a productive struggle that actually helps me with neuroplasticity and things like that. So tell me a little bit more on the intent side, intentionality and what's going on there. Well, how do we actually help guide towards a goal? How do we know their goals? How do we help people?
Yeah, so it's picking up on multiple signatures and amalgamating them in different ways. I mean, in the case of the game, or if you're wanting to drive neuroplasticity, you don't want things to be too easy. You don't want things to be too hard. If they're too hard, and if they're too hard, I've worked with a lot of species, and we're no different. You zone out, you stop trying. Those things are pretty. So do monkeys, so do cats, so do dogs. We all do the same thing, right? And if it's too easy, you don't get learning, or you get confounded ways that people solve the problem. And so tracking cognitive load in a game to optimize neuroplasticity is really relevant. But when you're trying to figure out intent, it's about this amalgamation of the signatures, right? So in the case of the eye, I have an ambiguous signature, but once I pair that with machine learning of other signatures, I start to get an idea of intent, right? Or of what's really going on. So if I take a game, or I take, let me use an example of, I pick up cognitive load in the ear of an individual wearing an AirPod, right? Or, that happens to have sensors in it, which they don't right now to do this, but they very well could. And I don't know how my technology should react. What does that mean? But at the same time, I have microphones. There's a microphone. That microphone helps me decode context. Might have picked up on a increased intensity in the way I was speaking, as well as a shift in how loud I was speaking, as well as some semantic context of multiple talkers, and that I'm trying to have a conversation. That can be you can easily, I say easily, but there are a lot of efforts to look at these things, and machine learning or AI that's trying and that can decode that there is a conversation going on, and somehow I'm having difficulty in that conversation. Now I have a device that's reactive, modifies the signal to noise ratio in my ear of the sound I'm listening to. And that's picked up, it's inferred my intent. Maybe in some cases, maybe intent is clearly stated, and it's something that is directed. But in this case, it's using multiple signatures and the ability to do that very effectively at low cost, very rapidly, 5G being a critical driver of these types of very fast turnaround experiences that are reactive, but hugely impactful to destigmatizing, to making this device feel like an extension of my psyche. And then suddenly you have something that is reactive to your environment, your context, and your need.
Professor Crum, watching this entire conversation has been Robin Arnott, who's building products, and I think he now has burning questions about what he's up to and where he's going to go. So speaking now for kind of like people who are trying to put this in action, Robin, I know you had a question, and welcome back.
Thank you. Poppy, lovely hearing you speak. I have a question about, so I was talking, for people who were listening about 20 minutes ago, I was talking about moving away from digital inputs like keyboards and mouses and things like that take our intent and into more biosensor inputs and what that can do for experience design. And I'm curious to hear from you, what biosensor integrations, what hardware biosensor integrations do you see being integrated into consumer devices in the next, say, 2 to 5 years, like for technologists and experienced developers like myself, and like I'm sure many of your students? What are the sensors that you think that we should all be looking at most closely?
So pupilometry and the richness you can gather from, changes not just in where someone's looking, because we know we have foveated rendering and those sorts of things in VR goggles, but the dilation and the richness that can tell you with other sensors about someone's internal state. Absolutely, that will be there. That's well on its way. The ear, again, I think you'll start, I believe we will wear devices in our ears more often to listen to our internal state than to actually play us music. To listen to our internal state and interact with our many devices in our homes. That, because it becomes, you've got a microphone, you've got also the ability to write the brain through vagal nerve stimulation, something that is going, potentially another way to really optimize and help the brain, emphasize certain information within a temporal, within a certain time window. So you've got this like USB port to your brain that is really we've already started seeing a lot of sensors get successfully deployed into the ear. Valencell has a lot of licensing opportunities that companies are building in, and it creates a really rich platform, I think. So I also think breath in homes, your body, there's so much that we can pick up in these areas. Just in the chemical composition of our breath, you can read emotion, you can read stress and suspense. So you can imagine an environment that is very reactive, though, just on some simple signatures, obviously in our headphone or in the glasses, or picking up on, from a camera.
In that clip that we showed from Westworld, the implication there was by the time we were able to feed back into ourselves, either through the existing senses of sight and hearing, or perhaps with an implant, we could go pretty far to affect us. And you're talking about some pretty powerful stuff. So I'm just imagining if we put our thinking caps on and your students are now, say, 5 or 10 years out,
yes,
how much are we controlling? How is the world different? How close are we to some of these science fiction scenarios?
How close are we to some of these science fiction scenarios?
Well, paint a picture for us. Okay, we're there now, but
I think we're there now. I think, no.
I think the question
is just unevenly distributed.
But no, I think the question here is paint a picture. Look, we look at what Robin's doing, or we look at the kind of stuff Nicole has shown us, and we're clearly at the beginning of some steep curve of being able to affect how we cognitively behave. We're beginning to close in on perhaps the limit of meditation, but now we're pushing beyond that because we're able to pick up all this real-time data. And I'd love for you to paint a picture. Okay, how does that then feed back? Are we creating deeply artificial experiences that further pull us from reality? Are we creating a broad-based, healthier states? Just paint a picture for what this might be a few years out.
Oh, okay. So, I mean, this is, I think we've really transformed how we can think about internal state, but I agree, we're not there yet. And I spend a lot of my time focused on, I care, as someone who was an invasive physiologist, I don't believe in invasive physiology, invasive implants as our future when we have the opportunity for that, when there is any potential for that not to be the only solution. But the ubiquity and amalgamation of these non-invasive sensors and that closed loop experience and modulation of our mind, of our internal state is, I believe we are going to see a lot of transformations in the next 2 to 3 years of this being something that is much more prevalent. To one of I'm not sure I'm answering your question, but I think we're far away from some things. But when you ask me, one thing I said earlier in the chat that was on here, when you think about, are we going to be in a place where people can manipulate my mind? And I think we're already in that place. That's what art is, as far as I'm concerned. I like to describe Bach as one of the greatest, controllers of the human mind with regard to understanding, how our brain unpacks frequencies, and, what he created became, the rules of counterpoint, which are essentially a manifesto followed by composers for hundreds of years. And, we are in a place where art can be translated in very, as in a state where it's not just we've created this, we now know what we can actually track, what the experience of the user is throughout the entire pathway. And, Leo Tolstoy used to has described art as only existing in the mind of if the intent of the creator was realized by the person on the other, the subject on the other end. We're in that world exists now.
And of course, if you think about it, so much of media moves us through art. I mean, this is exactly what music was and what film was, and clearly what gaming behaved. But it's also, when we think about kind of the more operational parts of tech, we're at this frontier now where, if you think of the early days of big data, we were looking at effluent data that talked to us about traffic patterns or health patterns, right? But now, as we're really unlocking these inner things and all the range of what you've pointed out we can sense through the eye or through the ear, in a way, the artist takes center stage, because what we're now programming is emotion and aspiration and these things that are in artists, and they've expressed themselves in canvas or gaming and code. But now here's a whole new way to express yourself in code.
There was we did an experiment with the directors of Free Solo. Did everyone see Free Solo? It's amazing. Alex Honnold is a very unique individual. It's a beautiful film. And it's a slide I use in some of my talks, but it's the reason it's so powerful is it's just looking at the breath of the audience, the chemical composition of the audience, looking at carbon dioxide in the room, right? And the story I tell is, look, I wasn't there when some of my team was tracking this, and you put CO2 is heavier than air, so you can put the tubes on the ground, and it won't. It's very reactive. You can measure the real time density of CO2 in there with tight time frames, as long as you know the volumetric offset. And anyhow, I saw the trace with no annotation, no reference, and I hadn't even seen the film. I went and saw the film right away. And I looked at the trace, and we annotated it someone on my team annotated it after that. But you could see every part of the journey the storyteller was taking the audience on in the room. You could see where Alex summited. You could see where he failed. You could see where he hurt his ankle. You could see the love story just in the CO2. So it's like we're broadcasting this signature of our emotions. And for me, that was the powerful event. There's this just in the in the space, in the air that everyone is then breathing, you're picking up on the story, this emotional journey that the storytellers are taking them on. And I love that. For me, that's really powerful, because then we also look at ways that you get neural synchrony when individuals are in those common spaces. And there's this really, the air we're breathing is indicative of our emotions, and then that's also bringing us together in these spaces.
I'd love to bring Nicole back in, because Nicole, we're there's this whole ongoing conversation in the tech world about the intent that we bring to our tools. And when new media technology brought out, we're always very aspirational about it. TV was the window to the world. The internet was going to connect us all for good. Social media would make everybody kumbaya. But we also find out that they can be manipulated intentionally or unintentionally for the not good. So it seems that with these technologies, we put our fingers on very, very powerful things. But as a community, how do we both push them to the good, and how do you see kind of the ethics or the intent or the values? How do they get disseminated in the community that you're talking to, so we get good out of this, as opposed to manipulation?
Well, I mean, one of the burning points that I wanted to make, and I love Poppy Crum. Love Poppy Crum. A couple of things, like the point that Poppy made about, humans have been, manipulation is an interesting word, but humans have been pulling on levers of other humans since the very beginning. And, people have known how to do that. What has been missing, as Poppy said, was the ability to track it longitudinally. And so the point that we're also at right now, because nothing's going back in the bottle, we're at the point where the tools are not actually in the hands of the people yet. Like they're not in the hands of the people. And so the danger at stopping right now is that, my ability as an individual to have agency over how I use these tools is not yet back in my own hands with the modality plus the longitudinal tracking in a way that makes it easy for me to do it. And so there's lots of conversations that people have about, it's interesting when you're in these conversations, you get into a lot of things about, well, people really only want, they only want the lowest common denominator thing. And I actually don't think that that's true. So I guess that's my hopefulness. I think that human beings truly long to be connected and together. And we love to be interconnected with one another. And so where I think the loop actually finally gets closed is that I think that we've never been good at it. I think we have this belief that we used to be good at it. And I don't think we ever really have on a very highly skilled level. So we're kind of like in the middle of a process. We're halfway pregnant. The souffle is hot, but it hasn't come up yet. And, and so the reason why a lot of this work has to continue is because until we get it back into the hands of the people, in a way that allows them to understand what they're doing and gives them agency over it, then that middle ground is the ground that, is ripe for the manipulation that everybody is worried about. And we still, it's like, we got to figure out the data privacy part, but that is the overall arc that has to happen. So we actually have to push through, and be humble and, and not be dogmatic, about, what the individual choices are, and basically create meta systems that allow people to tweak, what they're comfortable with. So
I'd like to. Oh yeah.
I just wanted to say one thing, Nicole, which is I completely agree. And the data privacy part, that is one thing, because of the situation right now, that is, the accelerations on that are, they're going to transform so many things that would have taken a much longer time to be realized, because the data privacy issues have to be solved.
I'd like to add here and Poppy, you've touched on this, Nicole, you've touched on this, but I'd really like to state explicitly the importance of art in this. And obviously the sciences and the arts are coming together in such an integrated fashion. Where I'd like to see that happen more is the arts and medicine and so on. There's still separations here. But where I think art is so important, so critically important is this in this domain and in leading this domain is that we go into art, both artists and people who experience art come into art with the sole intention of they're driven by novelty. They're driven by nourishing themselves, They're not driven by trying to achieve some external phenomenon, either some success or something, or to fix themselves, which is the mindset so many of us come to medicine with. Art brings the best out of us. It brings the best out of us for like if you're listening to Bach, like Poppy, you mentioned, listening to music that you love brings the best out of you and brings something of you into the place where transformation can happen in consciousness. And it's the same with artists. Artists are, we might be trying to shift your state, but we're not trying to exploit some outcome out of you. We're trying to just give you an experience. And I think that as this technology improves, I believe that artists are going to be leading the way in the implementation of it, but also in the ethics of it. Because look, so many of the ethical concerns that you've mentioned, Nicole, like privacy and so on, for many artists, those are not relevant concerns because like the stuff I'm making, and I think the stuff other people are making, it uses all this data, but it uses it live. Like I have no impetus to keep your data. So I just think art is so important to all of this.
If I might throw out some thoughts in this world of arts. I'm also chairman of something called Gray Area, which is an art and technology center here in San Francisco, right? So we have been nurturing where artists and code work together, and how do you express yourself in mechanisms like this. And in this COVID moment, when so much of the physical art world isn't happening, to the great danger of museums and concerts and stuff like that, it again is pushing these artists who express themselves virtually on how do we take the art form further. And I think here's an interesting opportunity that is coming up. As you know, Burning Man, the event at Black Rock City, was canceled this year because 70,000 people aren't going to the desert. It happens to be that the theme of Burning Man this year is the multiverse. That was the theme that was decided on a year ago, before all of this. And then Burning Man said, we're going virtual. So there's this interesting moment where you have one of the world's largest, most fun, and very conscious events created by artists bottom up, having to express itself virtually with this kind of multiverse theme. And on some level, ill-prepared for it. Burning Man is deeply prepared for people to go weld and build stuff, but it's actually a wonderful canvas for all of these forms of pushing emotion and ethical art, and how do we push ourselves to more spiritual states of consciousness, which is what happens if you're out there in the desert. So there's and Nicole, you and I have talked about this, and I spent a lot of time with other friends at Burning Man. I think that this cross-pollinating of communities, the kind of people who Poppy teach, what you see at your events, Nicole, Robin, what you think about, I'm just picking Burning Man as an example because it happens in August and there's cross-pollinating to go there. But also in general, it is a moment, I think, for the art community to express itself in this arena and provide some leadership here. So I just put that out.
Burning Man is already the invisible leader behind so many of these movements. The invisible thread that connects so much of this.
And I think that there's some very deliberate pushing, prodding, and thinking that Burning Man ended up right in the middle of a conversation that Poppy's been thinking about and teaching deeply with her students, Nicole, that you've been working on. And one thing this conversation has shown is it shouldn't be a casual thing. The stuff we're thinking about and the power that we're talking about is a conscious thing that artists can bring forward and help set a cultural direction and plane that can provide some leadership here.
The flip side of it shouldn't be, you said it shouldn't be a, what do you say? It shouldn't be a what thing?
Casual.
It shouldn't be. Yeah. I think there's a flip side to that, which is that it shouldn't be a serious thing either.
Yeah.
Do you mind if I take a moment? I wrote a manifesto about 3 weeks ago about technodelics. Do you mind if I read a paragraph from this, which I think is very relevant? So anybody listening can look this up. It's just called the Technodelic Manifesto. Weaving the disciplines of hypnosis, ceremony, meditation, and neuroscience into the fabric of a video game's feedback loop, technodelics are an emerging genre that is as new and sophisticated as any modern game, but rooted in something as ancient and universal as prayer. Games invite us to embody the needs and behaviors of a role, and to play a game is to practice the mode of being invoked by that role. Practice builds habit, and with repetition, habit becomes identity. This practice of play forges new neural pathways and articulates existing ones. It is always a gauntlet of self-authorship and transformation. Of critical importance, what the game is and why we are playing will define the parts of ourselves that we bring to that gauntlet. And if our fundamental reason for play is to distract ourselves, then we only bring those parts of ourselves that wish not to exist to the gauntlet. In doing so, we lay the seeds of nihilism in the soil of our play. And here's the important part. To fully support the transformation of the player into deeper and more self-realized modes of consciousness, game developers must learn to gently invite ever more vulnerable and forgotten aspects of the player's being into the light of play. Without collapsing into seriousness, players, in turn, must learn to approach their play with reverence and surrender. That's the extract.
Conscious play, purposeful play, but not serious play.
As soon as you're serious about it, you bring in the inner parent. And the inner parent is, its tool is judgment and shame, and that prevents you from having a transformative, growthful experience. We have to have these experiences with our inner child has to lead the experiences, which is why I think
you guys, I think Robin, you and everyone here are reminding me of the Games for Change festival that happens every June. I don't know quite if it's going to happen this year, but it's a 15 or 16-year-old festival. I think it'll be digital. And in fact, Nicole, we ended up bumping into each other there at Games for Change last year. And this notion of play for purpose and games for change and the ability to create psychological safety feels like a really important element in this. And yet, when I step back and look at this, Poppy, you mentioned, even when we were prepping for this opportunity for, there's Games for Change. And there's some wonderful, powerful things about thinking even about games being used as the text for high schools around social emotional learning, kind of like Tolstoy or another book would be used as the text in the past, so that kids, as they're growing, can actually learn about how to create an identity for themselves instead of necessarily feeling that they're brought in through other things.
Last night, my students, part of the class that they give a presentation on, a game that's transformed them in their lives, but they take it apart from psychological, social, genre, and then also sensory components that have influenced them. And last night, I had a student give a beautiful presentation on Undertale, and and about the role Undertale's had in teaching empathy, as a first-person shooter, and it was, I think
that's what we're going to see, and I think actually treating it
agreed
as well. I remember when I was young, my first computer was an Atari 400, and the basic cartridge and typing in games like Breakout, but from Byte magazine. You had to manually type it in and then save it off to a tape. Like Chris Crawford and other people were building these things like Adventure, but they were text games, and you were doing 5 pixels. But it was a joyous kind of thing to actually feel that sense of agency of making, but also how did you riff on people's games? How did you kind of build your version of it by tweaking things and stuff like that? And I think that's the other part of this is how do we help people in that journey from amateur testing the waters, I just want to mess around a little bit, to like finding their passion and exploring something and kind of messing around with it so it's safe, and then geeking out on the thing they discover and love. So I know that we're in overtime now if anybody needs to leave, but this is the kind of conversation I kind of don't want ever to end. So it's very exciting. You remind me just real quick of a few things. Randy Pausch, go ahead.
A quick question. When you say, how do we help people discover, what they're really interested in, how they geek out on it? Do you mean as a game or a game as a transformative tool?
I actually think of games, but a lot of the arts, I think more broadly, are a way for us to mess around. Mimi Ito put out a wonderful research report around how kids find agency and a sense of identity in third places in digital media and learning. So whether it's writing a tribute chapter to Harry Potter, or whether it's learning about DJing or making a video, or whether it's building a video game, there are a lot of different ways that we need to first have psychological safety. We kind of hang out, and then we get to mess around, but messing around doesn't have like a high social cost. I'm just messing around. Maybe I'm going to be a DJ, maybe I'm not. And then when you really find the thing you love, you're able to geek out and you really dig in deep. And so I don't know if I mean just games, but I do think that they actually have a sense of helping us move from self-doubt to curiosity to agency and to being able to believe that we can actually affect the world and the world isn't affecting us only. Like we have some sense in the world.
Well,
go ahead.
I think that the next generation of are you leaving, Poppy?
Yeah, I think it looks like
I have to leave and I have a hard stop, but I did want to say, we're talking about so many, empathy and things that can be learned in games, but I do believe that they are a critical part of extending human capacity, the human capacity and our capabilities in how we define ourselves as humans, not just how we define our cognitive processes, our sensory processes. Can I hear better than I do now? Of course I can. And games become a very rich environment that helps define. It's like I like to call it technology targeted neuroplasticity is a big part of our future, and that's all through, I believe, thoughtful and efficiently designed games, and it's really becomes then a part of how we think about the interactions we have with more broadly with technology. And the only reason I'm coming back to that is don't underestimate the role and the impact they have on who we are.
Absolutely.
Yeah, I agree. And so something really crazy. Like, I actually believe that.
Well, let's let Poppy go.
Yeah, I'm sorry.
Poppy, you've been so inspiring.
I think that transformation, or my work in transformative technology and my history in games, is going to absolutely come back together, because there's this new generation of games that are coming out there. They're going to be the social open worlds, of which, Fortnite, Minecraft, and Roblox are actually just the first. Like, they're the first advances of those types of worlds where
Maybe
there's a lot
Animal Crossing too, or something. I don't know.
well, there's a lot of user generated.
Yeah,
the user generated part of it,
content,
where I'm bringing part of me to this activity. And one of the other things that you sort of see is, and this is the idea, is that humans change when their story about themselves changes. So people don't stop smoking till they no longer see themselves as a smoker. Now they might have, there's a certain part about breaking. I actually like being on the multi-screen, because seeing your faces, it's better for me. But people don't change until their story about themselves change. So you don't actually stop being a drinker until you no longer see yourself as a drinker. Now, there's certain things that people need to have in order to help them break the physical addiction, but it isn't until the story changes that you change. And that is for everything. And so, if you think about games and the story part of games and the narrative part of games, so you take that part about human change, you take the narration of games. And I actually got into games because I thought it was the next evolution in human storytelling, for the purposes that, like, how do we know who we are, and how do we get to explore who we are? And how do we do it in ways that are safe, that allow for trying on different things? Like, one of the reasons why, one of the things that I think sports does for us is there's a part of the human psyche that, that needs a certain level of that sort of competition and violence. And so, I think sports allow people to have it in a very safe way. So, I think that's one of the interesting things about it. So there's, we can't, we can't, and I don't think we should seek to, eliminate the full range of human emotion and the different parts of us. But games can become very safe places to try things on and then choose something different. And so what I think will happen ultimately is that this sort of like the true transformative games, they will be places that allow you to do this. And I think games are going to become, especially the social open worlds, they're not going to be, specifically so tied to a particular storyline. They will, like, one of the hottest places, is the lobby in Fortnite, versus the game itself. People are talking in there. And so, I think these platforms have the potential to become a place where, we truly, truly get into, learning how to deeply connect and explore our own psyches, and then also start to weave who we would like to be. Because the other thing is that there's something about witnessing the change. So I can change, but I don't know that I've actually really changed until it's been witnessed by another human being. And that's actually one of the reasons why we so deeply need each other, because we really need to be witnessed by each other. So one of the things that we have in transformative tech is, like, there isn't, one of the things you never really see is, like, I never advocate getting rid of humans. I actually think the products are better when humans are in the loop, or the tech is in the background.
So you think humans should be around for a while? We should try to keep humans around.
So I got a question.
Not just robots.
But humans in the loop, it's like, if you actually want the change, you have to have a human there to witness that the changes happen.
Well, and I'm just playing, but I think you're right. I mean, we don't exist. We are not on the island. The other, the pair that we're with, the community with, shapes our world, shapes our environment. And, it goes back to Simon Scissors and just the way cognition works. We are shaped by our environment, and our environment is people, more than anything. And also, when you look at chimpanzee and ape primatologists, they actually study some of the social things going on there. And the bonobo chimps, we ended up doing a little activity with them. I might want to bring one of the bonobo chimp archaeologists or scientists on. She was telling us about how chimps bonobos particularly play. You'll actually, she shows footage of people like of the apes actually doing spins in the forest just for fun, and they're actually xenophilic. And it turns out that humans are xenophilic. We feel a sense of loss when we don't have anybody around us. Like that's very different than in some species that are xenophobic. That we're sort of, the other is obviously something that might eat us or kill us. We're actually xenophilic. And that's why we need a city. We need a community. We need to get together for like a dance or watch or something or play music.
This gets to, probably explains Twitch and the community nature of games. And I think there's an interesting point here. By the way, I want to remind people that you're watching Quarantime at quarantime.today, and we're on Facebook, and we're going in overtime because this is fascinating. And Nicole, Alex had this question early on, where do we find hope? And we probably find it in this conversation, because we're sitting here pushing the gaming environment kind of right on up to spirituality. I have a question which I want to put on the table, but I'm going to ask another one before that. Kind of every tradition kind of has this concept of achieving ever higher levels of consciousness and spirituality, or where you can get with practice. And in some, it's years of mastery, and the people who have it most are the dead saints. There's something about this that perhaps can accelerate our ability, Robin, to get to levels of transcendence, or perhaps increase the amount of connectedness that we have through technology that we appear to be accelerating. And I'm just wondering if Nicole, that's one of the things that gets you excited about all of this, because many of these things just take a lot of work. And perhaps one reason there's a lowest common denominator is it's a lot to climb that ladder. Does this give us some boost in how to be human?
Well, I mean, I think like I said, I have a strong desire for all of these tools to be democratic. And I've had the fortune of being able to study and go on, I've done a 33-day silent retreat in the jungle in Myanmar. That is a luxury. I mean, it didn't cost anything, but it's like the ability to take that kind of time out. I'm very cognizant that that's an elite experience. Going on a 10-day free retreat is still an elite experience. Not many people have that ability. And so, when we're looking at the arc of human history and the fact that we actually really need, the ability we need the distributed maturation of the human species. Like that's really what we need. We need to get really good at a lot of things very fast, so that we can also deal with things like economics, governance, like all of the equality, economic disparity, like all of these things that we have. So, we have quite a lot of resources, but what we lack is sort of like, the will and the vision. And part of it comes from where we are on Maslow's hierarchy of needs, and where we are on in our own conscious development. And so, I often get asked, like, is it cheating if you don't do it the hard way? And I'm sort of like, I don't think so. I think it's cheating if you don't do it if you don't do it genuine, in the genuine intention. But it's like right now, what happens, for example, with some of the traditional tools is that it's like when I'm sitting with when people are sitting with a teacher. I mean, there are some truly extraordinary teachers out there who they know exactly where you're at without you even being able to say it. But for the most part, people have to describe their internal experience to a teacher, who then has to assess if that internal experience is actually the same one as their thousands of other students. And just the description breaks down a lot. And so actually the meditation funnel of, how people get, or the pyramid, let me put it like that, the meditation pyramid of the number of people that actually sort of like make it through the quote unquote, levels of being able to have the kind of, authority over their own mind. It's actually not that great, because it's really, really hard. And so, the use of the technology shouldn't be to get rid of, these teachers or anything like that. It should be to giving people greater visibility, so that when they have the opportunity to be in front of a teacher, they can actually use it, because there are not many of these, like the number of people who are truly great at this. You would want to, it's like if if you had a chance to speak to the world's leading expert on something, whatever your hobby is, you wouldn't want to waste that time with a lot of questions of what you could learn on Wikipedia. So it's sort of like, it's the same sort of thing.
I'm feeling like we need to have like a whole episode just on teaching, because my mom and my sister were teachers, and my dad later in life was a teacher, and I feel like I love teachers, and I think just what you're talking about, we need to think about and talk about some of these people that are out there on the front line, and maybe many cases who are treated with the least amount of respect. We don't treat teachers like the NBA champions or the heroes. I know, Robin, you're going to have to get going, and we probably should wrap up our overtime. I had a question for you, Robin, in terms of you just showed off something, and I'd love our viewers to be able to actually check it out. Where would they go? How would somebody, like, if I haven't tried it, but I'd like to try it, how would I try it?
Awesome. I'd love to get into that. First, I just want to drop a note about this teacher thing while it's up. And that's the, we have our human teachers who are so important, but for me, and perhaps for you as well, there's also our plant teachers. For me, especially developing a psychedelic experience, ayahuasca has been such an incredible teacher. And that might sound like a metaphor, but to respectfully...
I did not expect you to go there, Robin. I think that's very fascinating. Yeah, but really... but I also think there are there are biophilic design patterns. There are amazing things that we've been able to see about just going out in the forest changes your cognitive state.
Just looking at the trees. I was listening to a cricket the other day, and it was like, oh, thank you for teaching me. Yeah. So, Nicole, you're talking about sort of translating or expanding, building a platform, the work of these teachers. I think there's a way to zoom out and think about that exact same process, not just with the teachers of like sages and wise people, but also
but the rest of the wildlife around us and the planet. So there are a whole bunch of other things. I know you've got to go, Robin.
Yes.
So
Robin, I have a final question I want to ask the both of you. Before perhaps then we'll wrap up on some of this aspirational stuff. We've never really spent any time on the addictive side of gaming, and it may be. I mean, clearly these things pull you in and allow a transformation.
A worthy conversation.
But I mean, there's also a whole downside to these powerful technologies that are there right now. And I watch people who are, inside of an artificial world for many hours. Perhaps, Robin, you're designing your stuff to take that energy and take it somewhere else. But Nicole and Robin,
I can give you a very specific. I can give you a very specific answer. Yeah. So one of my human teachers is Dennis Weir, who I've never met in person, but I read his book, The Way of Trance, and that's had a really profound impact on how I think about trance and art and game design, frankly. And he talks about so much of human psychology being made up of trances, and trances are autonomous internal loops. And complex trances are internal loops that are sustained by other internal loops. So do you understand what I mean so far?
Sure.
Okay, great. So as far as making experiences go, and by that I mean like game design, and you can think about game design like I think about game design, which is a ritual experience, or you can think about game design as like a slot machine designer. There are two ways of approaching the problem. One of the cleanest ways to address the issue of addiction is to understand the issue of trance. And what I'm doing very intentionally, and I've only been able to do this because I've done the research and I understand it, and because I stumbled upon this book, is understanding the importance of ending the trance. So at the end of the SoundSelf experience, you come back into the tree and there's a shavasana and a closing meditation. We don't just here's the end of the experience and leave you in the trance. A slot machine leaves you wanting more. So responsible experience design means, yes, bringing people into a deep trance, but then ending it. Thank you.
Oh, I love that. Oh my God, I love that. And then the part that I would put on it is that a lot of times many people don't know that when they're watching someone play a video game, that person most likely is playing with 10 to 40 other people. So it is not a solitary experience. Just because you don't see the other people doesn't mean the person that you're dealing with or what person you're watching is alone. They are not alone. And some of the games that have the most uptake around them are ones where people are with other people. And so what I saw working on the back of World of Warcraft was friendships and connections and how people were using it to be with people that they'd like to be with. Now, the real challenge is that there is this bias, and I consider it a damaging bias, actually, where people believe that if a relationship isn't physical, it's not a good relationship. I think that if you feel loved, you feel seen, and you feel like you belong, it is a real relationship, whether it is digital or physical. So I think that is a damaging bias because it doesn't allow people to have a mix of relationships. It's like, should you only have digital relationships? No, you shouldn't. But should you only have physical relationships? It probably means you are in a completely uniform community of people who only think like you, are only like you. And that, I think, is also, that's not a great situation either. And so I think it's this mix, and what we really need to focus on is how do we teach people how to have great relationships, whether they are digital and physical. And so when we talk about, the multiverse and all of the things that's coming, people often say, Nicole, I'm so worried about these experiences being so much better than the real. Well, the thing is that they will only be better than the real if we don't help people get better in the real, right?
Yeah.
And so if we use the games to teach people how to be better in the real, then they will enjoy the real as much as they enjoy the games, because there are things that we can only do physically. And so I think I know it's a little bit of a loop, but it's interesting.
Yeah.
And so
I need to give, I know Robin has to jump off, but I love that. Robin, where can we find the soundscape? I mean, where can we try it out?
Great. It's you can learn more about the project at soundself.com. If people are watching on Twitch, I know that SoundSelf is one of the games you can look for on Twitch. And we either sell it directly from our website, or you could go just look it up on Steam or on the Oculus Store if you like that. That's
Hey, Robin,
SoundSelf.
final question. The real gaming world is full, as Nicole points out, of multi-user playing with the community. In this transformational, the kind of work that you're doing, what's the future of this as multi-user? How can I have the kind of experiences you're having with others the way I do at Burning Man?
You mean like transformative experiences?
The game that you've just launched is a single-user game, but I want to have a transformative online experience with all of my friends who I'm not quarantining with, but I care about.
We are implementing, this will take a little bit of time, but we're implementing a multi-user, a way that you can experience SoundSelf with two people. And as far as future experiences go, I mean, Sangha is so important to transformative experiences. I think that whatever we begin developing next, or whoever we begin working on next, we're going to be really seriously exploring the question of Sangha and experiencing transformative experiences together.
I love that you're going to leave me right when you leave, you're going to throw out a word that I have no idea what it is. So I'm just going to write it, but we're going to have to pick this up later. And Nicole, you mentioned this sense of community in like World of Warcraft. I want to do another book drop.
Thank you very much. This has been delightful.
Sangha.
Yeah, and Sangha is the word for community. I also think, this thread of change doesn't happen unless it's witnessed, or it changes, but it doesn't get cemented. It's sort of like when you go back to your college, a reunion, and you realize, oh my God, I have really changed. Or when you see that person that you were dating, that it's like you were just like, this is the best thing ever. And then you see them 5 years later and you're like, what was I thinking? And that's when you know that you've changed. So, change requires witnessing. And that's one of the, I think, and so I think that's one of the reasons why we always have to have humans in these technological transformative loops.
Okay, we covered a lot of ground today. I just want to drop one thing. Nicole mentioned, even though they look like they're alone, there's this community going on. It just might be, tunneling through the wormholes to other places on the planet, and the community starts evolving, and that sense of things. A wonderful book that has one example in this, Werner Vinge. It's a fact book, even though he's a hard science fiction author. Was True Names and Other Stories, and he talks about how people using early gaming, like in the well and other things, actually got married on the bulletin board, like for real. They got married on the bulletin board, and this richness of social connection came out even in the very first signals that we were getting in the 80s and 90s. You know, for people that could actually participate. This is part of what makes humans humans, and play. In a sense, you play with your puppy and it learns how to be a good dog and not bite your head off. You play, you know, all animals play in some ways. And so I think that this is a fundamental way that we learn. And just this whole feeling of how do we build community in real life? How do we help people close the ritual so that we can kind of help with that shutting down addiction? I think Mohib, who is in the comments, mentioned that he's got a friend who he finished smoking, is what the friend describes. Like that's something he's done with, and he's moved on from it. Versus treating it like it was this malady that would hunt him his whole life. And I think the way we describe things, the mythologies we build for ourselves, and I think Nicole, you mentioned that earlier. We sort of we change the story when we tell ourselves a different story. I think is a huge component to this whole thing. I think we've totally run into the overtime land.
Remind people, first of all, if you want to share this or go back and look at it on Facebook, it's Quarantime Today. On the web, quarantime.today. We are going to be back. And also, if you come to quarantine.today, you can sign up for our newsletter, and we document a lot of these, put resource pages up. We will be back on Friday with the show on the Reckoning, the digital reckoning. Mick, you want to tell us a little bit about Friday's show?
Yeah. Sophia Noble, who's a researcher and author of a book called Algorithms of Oppression, has spent more than a decade exploring how these algorithms that are used for what looks like the promise of technology have actually in some ways unleveled the field more than ever for different communities that already had a hard fight to just feel like they were playing on a level field. And she in some ways believes that we need to look at the infrastructural challenges here. So not just the promises of technology, but what are the perils if we actually want a better world? And how do we not normalize things that we know are wrong? And there's this unfortunate sense that this might happen right without us even noticing it. And what would be a case for even reparations from the tech companies, the same way people have made a case for reparations in other ways. So she'll be joining us on Friday to really dig in on this. What happens when algorithms oppress, and when tech companies that actually created those algorithms are then given the keys 10 years later to say, you're the ones that are going to help us figure out how not to oppress people. Is that going to work out? So we'll talk about that on Friday.
And as we head into May, Quarantine will start focusing on this world we must build. On May 6th, which is a week from today, we'll be joined by the top global supply chain expert at the World Economic Forum and leaders of San Francisco's International Economic Development Agency and some people who are working on logistics to take a look at what happens to the global supply chain. What happens when our national government is down on China and California trades with China? How does production change? How do we get more resilient where there's both international trade and local production? So we kind of put a halt to the global supply chain and manufacturing. How do we bring it back? And then on May 8th, on Friday, we're going to dig into what happens to our cities. One of the key things that went on in this COVID crisis with distancing is we've kind of shut down downtowns. We've turned against density and mass transit, and we're not sure people should pack into office buildings or if they even want to go back to concerts and office buildings. So Kent Larson from the MIT City Sciences Lab will be joining us together with kind of other top city people from around the world as we dig into this question of cities and real estate and where we go next. And then the following week, we'll be joined by leaders of the UCSF Innovation Lab and Health Hub, and we're going to take a look at innovation in the world of medicine. And then later on, we'll take a closer look at where VCs and entrepreneurs are looking. Really, as we move into the future, a point that Nicole made today and Alex Lloyd asked about, where is there hope? Well, there seems to be hope in the innovation and the human capacity that is moving towards what we build next. You may have noticed that in the last month, people have talked about artificial intelligence less because we've been long on people at a time when we have problems that people are particularly good at solving. And Nicole, I want to thank you for helping to frame today's show. You know, one thing that I think that we've learned is that at a time when we have exponential technologies and exponential problems, we probably need to develop people exponentially, our emotional and spiritual capacity, our empathetic capacity. This probably goes back to what Einstein said after we developed the atomic bomb, that if we didn't really accelerate human development quickly, we could run into trouble. Well, we know that to be true now. And I think what this has shown is, while we started talking about transformational tech and kind of today's problems, what we're really talking about is that by cheating, by using technology to accelerate our capacity to achieve what practices and wisdom have tried to achieve for years, that may be the thing that gives us hope to expand humanity at a wavefront just faster than our technology and our problems. And if we do that, that would probably be good.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I my keynote at my conference this year was called the Faster Train. And so the problems are in one train. and really, I think it's like, really the hope for humanity is that we have to get human growth and development, our wisdom and all of that stuff on a faster train than the problems that we've created. And the belief that we can just put it all back in the bottle and go back to some sort of nostalgic past is naive. What we have to do is we have to get on the faster train, and that's the way we can craft a world that's actually big enough for all of us.
I love the fact that we build the future with references to the past, because even as you told us to move beyond nostalgia, we got on a train. And with that, we will retreat to the dining car where beverages are being served. And we'll be back on this train on Friday.
Well, so wait a second. One thing you can't end on that. The thing is that sometimes these analogies and metaphors are useful to help people understand what you're talking about.
Yeah.
And you're right.
Yeah, we build on kind of what we know.
Ironic about that. We describe what we're doing next in terms of things we've been. That's how we understand. When I was at Apple and we invented HyperCard, this was 1987, before the web, we could not explain to people what a link was. Like, what was that like? It was like nothing. It was a real big pain. So yes, we have to explain the future in terms of the past. Okay, and with that, we're going to put a real ending on this show.
I love these shows. Thank you so much for having me.
Thank you. It is now 5:57 Quarantime, and we'll be back on Friday.
Quarantime.
Omi, take us out. Run the ending.
Take us out.
Let's get close, but not so close. Quarantine. You can share from a distance. Quarantine. You know we want to see each other. You'll have to stay in your quarantine space while we talk.